I would now like to introduce today's speakers, who each bring a unique and I know informative perspective to today's event. So first of all, I have the Director of Cybersecurity Operations from DFSI, Mel Comerford. Mel is very kindly stepping in for Maria Milosavljevic, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today. So I do thank Mel for stepping in for us at this late stage of the proceedings. Data security is fundamental to good privacy practice, and I look forward to hearing how the New South Wales Government will achieve this. We also have here today the Chair of the Law Society of the New South Wales Privacy and Communications Committee, Principal of Data Synergies, and Gilbert and Tobin consultant, Peter Leonard. I know Peter's views on the new and old ethical challenges posed by new digital technologies will be thoughtful and stimulating. Microsoft Australia's Director of Corporate, External and Legal Affairs, Tom Daemen. Tom's contributions to the broader debate about data security, privacy and public-private relationships are impressive, and I think very relevant to us today in our environment where government increasingly makes use of private sector facilities and technologies. I will also be participating in the panel discussion. In addition, we have as our MC today, Melanie Marks. Melanie is a recognised figure in the privacy industry and current president of iappANZ, the International Association of Privacy Professionals. iappANZ is the preeminent forum for privacy professionals in Australia and New Zealand. I'm sure today that we'll hear stimulating discussions of the challenges and the opportunities private sector and government organisations face in harnessing the power of technology, while at the same time protecting and respecting people's personal information. Recent events with Facebook and the Commonwealth Bank have certainly put the media spotlight on the importance of privacy. And while private organisations are not under the jurisdiction of the New South Wales legislation that I am responsible for, these events have stimulated interest and debate in the importance of embedding privacy principles into the work that we do. I hope that by sharing our personal experience in managing privacy effectively today, we encourage you to consider ways to continuously improve your own privacy management practices. And with that, I will hand over to our MC, Melanie Marks.
So to the panel, I think we'll start with a question for everyone just to get us in the mood. And that question is, what would you see as your top challenge in privacy in 2018? And I think we'll start with Tom, simply because you're making eye contact. Hello, Tom.
Should have learned that in school. Never look at the teaching. The number one challenge we have right now, I would argue, is the number one challenge we've had for a number of years. As a technology company, it's very easy for us to immediately think it's all tech, when in the reality, the practical reality is that culture plays an incredibly important part of the privacy and data security story. It's not to say that technology isn't important, as the Commissioner referenced. Privacy by design is one sort of high-level construct, all the way down to some very low granular details like the nature of encryption that you use for data at rest. But at the end of the day, all that technology can go for naught if the culture isn't right, if the culture isn't there, if people don't really trust and believe that this stuff matters. And so the number one challenge we have is reminding people that at the end of the day, this is more than just a technology issue. It's a people issue and it's a culture issue.
Absolutely, and I think actually that's a good segue to go to Mel. Mel, I know that part of your role is in preparedness, and surely that's got a big people component, and you do a lot of crisis management preparedness. So from your perspective, the top challenge in privacy this year?
I think we are working more and more in a global world, and I think the impacts of that global data shift and mobility. So we have much more data on mobile devices, so you're much more at loss as to where that is, but your obligations still pertain to that data no matter where it is. So I think the global ecosystem is interesting. For us, the other challenge is shifting the discussion away from, or trying to shift the discussion away from, it's an IT problem. Privacy and even cybersecurity are not an IT problem, and it's trying to engage that business risk ownership and understanding of the value of your data.
Excellent. Sam, a perspective?
Yes, thanks, Mel. So I'm going to echo some of what Tom said. I think culture and capability are really important. And so there are many challenges in privacy, but I'm going to nominate those as the big challenges this year. And culture is so important that it comes from the top. So the executive needs to believe that good privacy practice is important, and then needs to model that sort of behaviour so that it becomes something that's important right throughout the organisation. And at the same time, from the top, needs to recognise the need for good privacy capability within the organisation.
Okay, Peter?
I think there are two challenges which come to mind. The first is that the data ecosystems around almost all businesses and agencies are now so complex and multi-party, and the obligations that regulators rightly put on organisations are in respect of the end-to-end handling of information, not only the handling by the organisation itself. So that in turn means that organisations need to get beyond what had become a bit of a game of pass the parcel, just put privacy obligations on everybody else in contract, but not actually see whether they fulfil those obligations or not. So that's the first thing I'd say, that pass the parcel isn't good enough anymore. The second is, in a word, humility. One of the things we've learnt about privacy by design and security by design over the years is that anything that can possibly go wrong generally will go wrong. And, in a network system, in a data ecosystem, you're only as good as your weakest link. And many organisations, when you read their privacy impact assessments, kind of work backwards from justifying whatever it is that they want to do, and they're not sufficiently humble about what can go wrong within their own organisation, or indeed what may go wrong in other organisations that they deal with. So, two words, I suppose. Firstly, humility, and accepting that many things will go wrong, and secondly, don't play pass the parcel.
Can I dig a little into that? So, to the humility point, once you have that, I guess, awareness of and humility, what action do you think that should be driving in organisations to manage some of these complex supply chain and ecosystem challenges?
Well, I think often it means that you can't outsource or devolve responsibility for a privacy impact assessment to one individual. Frequently, you'll need to have a range of voices at the table, at least security, network and cyber security involved in the discussion. And also infrequently there'll need to be an ethical or social fairness, social licence discussion. And they're hard discussions that require a variety of perspectives and views to be brought to the table to ensure that you actually cover off the range of concerns that different sections of the public, different sections of citizens might have. And so I think humility is partly about not thinking that you can represent the world in your views, and bringing enough people to the discussion that you're likely to get a reasonably representative cross-sample of views and perspectives.
Interesting. I think we'll come back to that one of the questions we've got coming up with you later. If I can move the conversation on to a different topic, certainly some of the events that we've all seen in the press over the last few weeks, and I won't particularly call anyone out, have focused on trust, and trust, from my perspective, being the concept that compliance is not enough. There are ethical behaviours and there are transparency expectations of consumers which actually surpass legal expectations. So for me, that's what trust is. I'd like to turn to Sam now and ask you,
I wasn't looking at you.
You're on the hook for the next one, Tom. My question is, from a New South Wales government and regulator perspective, how do you see trust sort of taking a part in the strategy around privacy protection? How important is maintaining trust, and what advice would you give people in the room?
Yes, so thanks, Belle. I think trust is paramount, and privacy is one of the ways that we can demonstrate that we're trustworthy as organisations. So particularly for those of us who work in government, we deal with people's very sensitive personal and health information on a day-to-day basis, and people often have no choice but to give us that information because they don't have a choice about doing business with us if they want a driver's licence or they want to go to hospital. So therefore, trust is even more important in the sense of government services than I think it is with other organisations. And so the way that we can actually demonstrate trust to the people of New South Wales as agencies is by, including good privacy practice in everything we do. And so that includes making sure that when we have a new initiative, a new service delivery initiative that might be very exciting, that might involve new technology, that we build privacy into it from the start so that we take a privacy design approach and we don't try to bolt it on at the end. And we think about the risks and the implications of what we're doing for people's personal information. Because, of course, it doesn't take much to lose trust, and it takes a very, very, very long time to rebuild it. So it's very important for us in government to demonstrate that we're trustworthy, and particularly to use privacy by design in the work that we're doing.
Mel, from a kind of security in agencies perspective, what practical steps can you advise agencies and others in the New South Wales public sector to take to maintain trust?
Following on from the points earlier, I think transparency is key. I think we have to be open and frank about acknowledging that we have dealt with the privacy concerns and that we understand them, and that we embed strong accountability and governance into not just the service, but the underpinning platforms and processes that hold that data.
And what about when things go wrong? What's your advice there? How do you keep trust? Or how do you set yourself up for success so that when things do go wrong, you are able to maintain trust?
Okay. I think the first one is acknowledging the impacts and the value of your data when you're looking at your response plans. So don't underestimate how important dealing with or talking about privacy concerns are. Make sure that they're paramount in your response and your recovery. Make sure that you're including all the stakeholders of that data. But in the first instance, have engaged those stakeholders in the design to provide assurance that their concerns around the way the information is held, transferred or stored are managed.
Tom, do you want to add anything to that?
Look, it's a trite cliche, but people will not use systems they don't trust. And maybe in the public sector context, people don't have a choice, but certainly in a private sector context, they do. No one forces people to use our service or any other service. And so we are constantly in a situation of having to convince people that we're trustworthy and that you can trust us or any large technology company with some of your most important information. And increasingly, for a lot of organizations, what is your most important information? What I find striking as people try to hit this new standard, which isn't a legal compliance standard, a trust standard, an ethics standard, something totally, totally different. A couple of weeks ago, IAPP and Microsoft hosted a GDPR event in Auckland. And it was, the weather was horrific, cyclone winds, terrible, and yet 100+ people showed up. And what I thought was fascinating is when you looked at the group of attendees, the overwhelming majority were not going to be subject to GDPR, or if they were, it would be some tiny small subset of their data. And then when you talk to them afterwards and you say, my goodness, it's horrific weather. We had one speaker whose car was crushed by a fallen tree and she was there. I mean, I like privacy, but not that much. And yet all these people showed up and you asked, why did you come? And it was all about the trust construct. Like, look, we're not subject to GDPR, and maybe not, I'm not going to cross every T and dot every I in GDPR compliance, but I can see where the world is headed. That is what people will expect of me from a trust perspective, and even though I'm not subject necessarily to the law, I know that's what people will expect. And if I can't get people to trust what I'm doing to hit that new global high watermark, they're not going to use my stuff, buy my services, whatever it happens to be.
Can I give one example which I thought was interesting? Last week I was interviewed by a Herald reporter who was basically trying to drum up a story around whether Commonwealth Bank should have notified its customers of the CommBank data breach. And a number of lawyers had expressed views on whether or not it was a serious enough breach that it would have met the standards under the new data breach notification laws. And my perspective was a bit different. I said, well, it doesn't really matter whether it was a serious enough breach or not. There was likely to be sufficient public concern, if and when it got out, that the bank should have said something. And it probably was not appropriate to notify all the individuals that might have been affected because there didn't appear to be a real risk that their information would be compromised, and even if it was, the bank, I imagine, would have to make good. But what the bank had done was made the decision not to notify, said nothing publicly, and then in the middle of a banking royal commission, out had come the story that there had been this so-called data breach, well, it was a data breach, and they'd said nothing. And if they'd simply at the time put out a media statement that said, look, we've had this issue, this is why we think the issue is managed and curtailed, and this is why we're not notifying people about it, I think it would have just washed under the bridge. But having come out as though it had been hidden in the middle of a royal commission, it created a major trust event for the organisation. And I think that's a classic example of how sometimes we get too hung up now on what the law is rather than thinking about trust and social licence.
That's a good point. I've got a few comments / questions on that one. I'll start with the question. We've talked about privacy, the biggest privacy challenge being the people issues. And from that, I think we mean, getting buy-in and action from the people that we require it from, and driving change. And I think as a privacy practitioner myself, we have come to the point where people do understand it as a compliance regime, largely, but the question of trust sometimes would require different business decisions to be made, and maybe all of those data uses can't be affected. Maybe something needs to be rolled out with various stages of piloting before it can be fully rolled out. There will be commercial implications from that trust discussion, and therefore it's a difficult discussion. My question to the panel is, can you draw on any experiences of winning over both, I guess, peers and operational staff, but also senior management and decision makers? So examples, and secondly, advice for the audience here today on that. Tom, it's you.
From my perspective, whenever I speak with privacy professionals, I always say the number one thing we can do to drive success for all of us is to convince our senior leaders to treat data as a strategic asset. Not as a compliance thing, but to treat data as a strategic asset. Incredible amounts of goodness, privacy goodness, can flow if you can convince your senior organization leaders to reach that conclusion. Now, how do you do that? And certainly 10, 15 years ago, that was easier said than done. Today, it's actually a lot easier because more and more organizations recognize that, as important as other assets are, boy, it is amazing how much runs through data at this point. And if you have senior folks in the organization who do not understand the importance of data to that organization, building the data set about the data set, really explaining how different groups within that organization rely on data, big data analytics. It can be very eye-opening to senior leaders who might be a few years removed from the day-to-day operation of the organization. And when you explain how finance and HR and everyone else, product planning, product developers, you'd just be amazed at how many people rely intensely on huge data sets at this point. And sometimes you have to collect that information and bubble it up to convince the most senior folks in the organization that you might look like a manufacturing company, but in fact, you are a big data company. You might look like a government agency, but in fact, you are a big data company. Might be a branding thing, but you'd be stunned at how quickly people can come to the realization that data is pretty close to the be-all and end-all of success for a lot of organizations these days.
Peter.
Sorry.
Mel, let's go to Mel and then Peter.
Sorry. I think that's key to it. And I think the other side of what we're working on is awareness at the ground level. So rolling out cybersecurity awareness training and privacy and information awareness training to all staff and making that part of induction packages, making that part of the ongoing discussion. And what I think that does is it allows the users at the coalface who are interacting with at the citizen end of government and data to understand and be able to shed light on some of the unintended risks and privacy exposures and allow that information to then also bubble up through those discussions. And I think that's a great tool for organisations to have that coalface.
Peter.
Mel, this is where I'm going to plug two books, which aren't my books. Well, I own the book, but I unfortunately don't own the copyright. One is Michael Lewis's book, The Undoing Project, which is about Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's work on behavioural economics, behavioural psychology. To summarise this book in a sentence, it shows why humans are often fallible in their thinking, and that in turn leads to a discussion of whether AI is less fallible or more fallible than humans, and what data analytics can expose about how humans are fallible and lead to better decisions. It's a book that everyone should read. The second one is Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. This is a fabulous book about how to influence citizens and individuals through appropriate public policy settings and when it's ethical and when it isn't. Now, the reason I raise it in this context is I actually think it's really easy now to engage senior management around discussions around data analytics and social responsibility. Got a whole lot easier with Cambridge Analytica a couple of weeks ago. Banking Royal Commissioners made it even easier. Everything is now conspiring to take that conversation into the boardroom. Once you get it into the boardroom, the next conversation has to be understanding the difference between good data analytics, good data-driven decision-making, and bad. And that's the hard next discussion that people have to have, because what you often find when you get into the boardroom is that they've already bought the story about how they need to be much more data-driven in making decisions, but they haven't thought hard enough about whether they've got the right algorithms, whether they've got the right people, the right data scientists to drive the use of those algorithms, whether they're asking the right questions, and whether the questions that they're asking are questions that citizens would be happy about them asking and answering through data.
Sam, would you like to make any further comment on this question?
Mainly just to say that we do get involved with a lot of projects across government, and so our role is often helping agencies just to understand some of the things they might do that will make their project more privacy aware, privacy responsible, because the interesting thing is that new technology and new digital service delivery can often be privacy enhancing in the way that it's delivered. So we have that conversation a lot with agencies, and I think it's important to realise that that it can be a very positive thing and not necessarily a negative thing to have a new technology project from a privacy perspective.
That's a good point. Peter, I'm going to come back to you, and this is potentially the cat amongst the pigeons question. It's a question about the public sector's practices versus the private sector. And I know that in your various roles you've worked with many organisations and public agencies and other entities. Thinking to maybe if we look at trust and we think, well, part of trust is only using information for the purposes for which you collected it or something that's appropriately connected with that. Do you think that there is a difference in the way that the public sector protects personal information, maintains trust and uses data appropriately versus the private sector? Who does it better? And you can take that question more broadly if you'd like.
I think the public service by its nature is more conservative than business. So there is greater thought about citizen trust and social licence in the public sector than there is in the private sector, or there has been historically. But I want to then, that's the positive. The negative comes back to my humility word again, in that there can be a view that you come across in parts of the public sector that kind of we're from government and we know best, or that because we're from government we will be moral and everyone should trust us. And that is a particularly challenged view in the world that we live in today. It's partly challenged because I can say this, to a significant number of the highest profile data breaches in this country have been federal government agencies, actually, not state government agencies. So manifestly, at least the federal government agencies are a bit challenged in expressing the view that the public should trust them because there have been problems. And secondly, it does lead to the production of self-serving privacy impact assessments. And you only have to look at some of the privacy impact assessments that have been mentioned. I'll go to a neutral example on the Bureau of Statistics website, including a number of privacy impact assessments that are still up there in relation to uses of data sets that were subsequently breached. And the thing that to me, when I read those privacy impact assessments, I kind of think, well, they've reasoned back from the conclusion that they wanted people to reach, which was, we're the good guys and we'll look after it, rather than, what could possibly go wrong? Have we covered it off? So they weren't written from the viewpoint of humility, and as a result, they came a cropper. And you can't afford to come a cropper nowadays because, trust in government institutions, in business, in politicians is at a historic low. You look at things like the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is an objective measure of trust in institutions. It's gone down in almost every major industrialised country. You can't kind of play dice anymore.
Are organisations looking at ethical frameworks across other regulatory or spheres of decision making? Question for you, Peter. Is this coming up in a vacuum, or is ethics the big topic?
Look, ethics. Last year I sort of banned ethics from my lexicon because every time I spoke into private sector organisations and used the ethics word, I could almost see the blinds come down on the C-suite executives. And so I started using the words social licence and corporate social responsibility, and I'd say exactly the same thing but substituting the word, and the reaction was completely different. I think now the Banking Royal Commission has suddenly made the big E word no longer a swear word. So everybody wants to talk ethics. The problem is that everybody wants to talk about ethical principles, and if I read another set of ethical principles, I think I'll throw up. everybody's got a set of ethical principles, but they're all at a level of generality that are just completely irrelevant in most organisations in their everyday business. And what people aren't doing is thinking, how do you operationalise thinking about ethics in the same way that we've operationalised thinking about privacy by design and security by design? And I actually think we've actually conquered a lot of the big issues around thinking about privacy and security. Doesn't mean the challenges of actually doing aren't as great as they once were, but at least we've got a common language for thinking about it and methodologies, processes for applying privacy and security by design. But we haven't even got to first base on ethics by design. We've got these abstract principles that read a little bit like the Ten Commandments and not the rest of the Bible to operationalise it.
Very true. And I might just survey the crowd, which I like to do. Has anyone here looked at operationalising ethics? Opportunity, Peter, opportunity. Oh, we've got a hand up there. Great. I'm coming to ask you questions afterwards. I'd like to take us down a different track entirely. The theme today is obviously privacy in the digital age. So let's get digital. And Tom, let's start with you. I'm going to take us to AI. We haven't really talked about AI at all today. How do you see ethics being operationalised in the age of AI?
Yeah, you took us down a different track, but didn't. Really?
That's true. Trick.
Yeah, it's a brutally tough issue, but I will simply repeat what Peter said, which is everybody has their 10 commandments of ethics and AI at this point, but nobody's actually taking it to the next level of granularity where it means anything. I could probably spend my entire days at this point speaking with our customers, public sector, private sector, small and medium and large, for-profit, not-for-profit, doing nothing but talking about ethics and AI. But all the conversations are at such a high level of abstraction and generality, and when you start probing and pushing a little bit and say, okay, well, let's take principle 2. How would you actually implement that? What are the trade-offs that you are willing to make? Are you willing to not use data in this certain way? Oh, no, we didn't mean that principle to mean that. Well, okay, what did you mean it to mean? You do not have to do a whole lot of analysis before you realize that a lot of these principles don't mean a whole lot to many organizations. And that's why I'm happy to take the speeches and presentations and discussions. But at this point, I think it's really important to start poking people a little bit, prod, and say, all right, what does it mean? What are you going to do? How are you actually going to make this real? And that's when the conversations often get pretty tough, because people haven't really thought about that level of implementation.
Who's leading the space for working out these problems?
Who's leading the space for working out these problems? I won't give company names for organizational names. I will say, echoing sort of Peter's comments a little bit, I think the public sector in some, it depends, obviously there's a huge geographic range here, but I would say on balance around the world, because governments tend to be a bit more conservative in their use of data and thinking of data, they seem to have both identified and implemented some ethical principles that they tend to stand by and have thought about in a little more detail. In the private sector, sometimes because people might be a little less conservative, it's a little easier to be a little more fluid with data and data usage. It's hard to actually operationalize some of these principles. So, for a completely generic statement, I would say around the world, I do see government doing more with ethics and AI and ethics and big data than I see in the private sector right now.
Sam, I don't know if you'd like to comment from a regulator's perspective on, we know that this concept and the 10 Commandments are really important, but what about making it real, that operationalising aspect? Any comment?
Well, I think one important tool that we have for building ethics in is to use something like the 5 safes, which is used for data projects, and that's making sure that you've got safe people working on the project, that the project itself is safe, which of course means asking the question, should we be doing this in the first place? That you've got safe settings, that you've got safe output. So I know for big data projects that involve analytics and AI, that the 5 safes can be used as a starting point anyway to actually build a whole information governance framework. that underpins the work that you're doing. But yes, I think the fundamental question first off is, should we be doing this? And that does come back to the ethical piece. Of course, in the public sector, and particularly in the privacy legislation, there is actually a public interest test. So that's very important in government when you're doing projects that might involve data sharing, analytics, new digital technology. As an agency, before you even come and talk to the Information and Privacy Commission, thinking about the public interest in what you're doing and making sure that the balance is firmly on the side of the public interest with the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Sam. Tom, digital question here. Sort of. The question is, do you believe that we can realistically keep sensitive information fully secure? Is that a true statement? Is there technology that's around at the moment? Is it sufficient, or is more needed?
We will almost end this where I began the conversation, which is, I don't, at the end of the day, view privacy, security, data security as a pure technology play. It is a culture play as well. So if the question is, can technology ensure 100% privacy and data security, I would say the answer to that is no. This is very much one of those issues in which it takes a village. It does focus on the people, the process, the culture of the organization. The only way we're going to get to a level of privacy and data security protection that we are all comfortable with is if we not treat this as a pure technology compliance, legal compliance driven exercise. It must be a much broader cultural partnership across the organizations to make that a reality.
Mel, I can come to you now. Obviously, Peter's touched on the complex supply chain and sort of ecosystem environments that we have at the moment, and outsourcing has become a much bigger proposition for all organisations, public and private. So the question is, within your role and within, I guess, more broadly for government, what role do you play in making sure that secure technology is implemented right up and down that supply chain?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think our favoured approach is establishing a panel of security products, and part of the reason for that is to create efficiencies across government in procurement, but also to utilise and take up, say, the ASD's suggestion of using independent entities to do some pre-assessment for known flaws and vulnerabilities in products. But it's important within that context not to rely on the technology as the only piece in the puzzle. The most important thing with any technology is the context in which it's used. So you have to look at what services you're going to provide, where that data is going to sit, where the value of that data is, and what is the impact on privacy or otherwise if there is a compromise or other issue with that service. So business owners need to get involved in that discussion. Business risk owners need to be involved in that discussion.
Okay, anything to add?
Yeah, look, I'll come back a little bit to what Peter said earlier, which is making sure that these procurement decisions, deployment decisions are cross-disciplinary. This shouldn't just be IT and procurement working together. When you think about a privacy compliance plan, it really needs to be the business decision maker who's using the data in conjunction with IT, in conjunction with, quite frankly, PR or corporate communications, depending on how the organization is structured. If you look at the companies, public sector and private sector organizations around the world who are most advanced in GDPR compliance, as one example, it's those organizations that view this as a multidisciplinary issue across the organization. Those organizations that said, ooh, big new global privacy requirement, let's dump it on legal, or let's dump it on IT. They are far, far behind those that said, this is actually an all-up business issue. It should be owned and driven by strategic business decision makers. There are roles and responsibilities for IT security, CISOs, privacy, chief privacy officers, legal communications. If you do not bring all those people together, you just simply aren't going to get where you need to go in this modern era right now.
And, I think some of those organisations that did GDPR well have discovered new sources of value
Totally.
in their
Absolutely.
data. So it's actually been value enhancing, not value depleting. The other thing I'd say is many of the new applications of data involve consumer or citizen empowerment. And again, there will often be a balance between delivering empowerment and convenience to consumers and privacy risk. And, you know, that comes up most frequently in relation to things like IoT, smart home. You know, there are privacy risks in many IoT devices in the home, but consumers want them because they're convenient. Well, are they told enough about those risks, and do they understand those risks well enough to manage them? Probably not. So if you actually want customer empowerment, you probably need to educate your consumers. Similarly with many information sharing within government. I mean, I love Service New South Wales. It's improved my life dramatically. I love the concept that I can use my New South Wales driver's licence to get a fishing licence in Tasmania. And that would be facilitated through good authentication matching across the states and territories, as currently proposed by the federal government. But that legislation also is about identity matching on a national scale that I find deeply troubling. And when I looked at that draft legislation and the explanatory memorandum and the minister's speech, it talked about robust privacy safeguards. I then went looking for the robust privacy safeguards. There weren't any. And so it repeated the mantra that all of this would be implemented with robust privacy safeguards, but they weren't in fact embedded in the legislation. So there's a classic example of a legislation where it will actually do a lot of things that are convenient and terrific for people like me, who don't want to have an Australia card, but want, it to be easy to authenticate myself across multiple services, so I'm not filling out forms all the time. And secondly, the importance of being humble in what you draft and, engaging with people. If it does need robust privacy safeguards, don't just say you're going to do it. Say what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and embed it in the legislation. Don't ask the public to trust you that you're going to implement it and then do it. Do I trust that the Department of Home Security will implement robust privacy safeguards if the legislation doesn't force them to? I'm sorry, I don't.
I'd like to loop back on something that you just mentioned, and that is the role of kind of educating the community. And I guess if we think about the context of smart devices in the home, even if companies demonstrated best practice, they explained everything possible, and let's just imagine a world where people actually read that. Is there a conversation that sits a layer up above that talks about the macro impacts on society and what it means for us as a society to go down that road? Because I sometimes think that the problem is a lot bigger than understanding what your one device in the home does. Thoughts?
I don't think it's one device anymore. I think part of the challenge is the interconnectedness, I should say. And I think there's still a lot of work to do, and we have power to leverage manufacturers to be much stronger in their privacy and security design decisions. There was something in the last couple of weeks with one of the home devices where they allow third parties to come in and plug in and add additional services to that, but they don't have controls over what those services could do. So one of those services came in and said, yes, I'm going to turn the microphone on to record this indefinitely. So that wasn't a presumption that the user would have had around that end device. So I think that's where we collectively need to inform and educate and push manufacturers and those standards to become much higher.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Mel on that. I don't think in this area that we can put it onto consumers. Yes, we can do a certain amount to educate consumers, but some of this technology is very complex, and the requirements for keeping it secure are complex as well. And I definitely think that manufacturers and other organisations involved need to step up in some of these areas.
I'll add one more thing around, from a government perspective and outsourcing services, where there is a responsibility on both parties, both the consumer of the service and the provider of the service. There is always a boundary where the underlying platform from the manufacturer or the outsourcer has a set of controls, but then there is a boundary of controls that you are in charge of. And if things go wrong, it's quite possible that that is because of your chosen control settings. So you can't outsource responsibility for those. You need to be across both sides of it and not assume that the provider has done it all for you.
Tom?
I think these are all wonderful examples of some of the incredibly challenging, if you go to a higher level of abstraction for a moment, there are some fascinating public policy choices and decisions that we as society have not yet come to grips with. These are concrete examples of that, but you can imagine, and there's some wonderful privacy conferences and ethics and AI events where you have to put out there, choice, public policy decision. Should we as a society be willing to give up a greater level of privacy and awareness of how we're using energy in exchange for reducing global warming? There are these incredibly difficult strategic public policy trade-offs that we really haven't made. And we can talk about the manufacturer should do this or a technology company should do that, but as society as a whole, we haven't come to grips with how we would prioritize some of these things. Or even if those are choices you have to make, maybe you can do both, I don't know, but right now we're not really having those big strategic cross-cultural questions.
I agree. I think, there's been some talk that we've all been asleep at the wheel over the last decade while these things have emerged, and some of them, no doubt our lives are better than they used to be, in my opinion, as a result of these technologies. I think there is growing awareness around the privacy implications, and that's where our conversation began today. But that higher level of policy decision making and what direction do we want to go in and what does this all mean, what does the future for our children look like, is one that I think we are not yet engrossed in, and I look forward to that one. Peter.
Can I just say something about consent? And, Tom from Microsoft, I should acknowledge that Microsoft has, for the last 10 years, as long as I can remember, been talking about how the notice and consent system is broken and concepts of consent kind of don't make sense anymore in this world, where people often don't understand what they're consenting to, or you're asked to consent to so many things. I actually think it's really important for government to forget the word consent, because in almost all of my dealings with government, I don't really have a choice. I don't deal with government because I choose to deal with government. I deal with government because government says I have to. And sometimes it's a bit different, like my gold Opal card, and if I can mention the war, the consent that I allegedly gave in order to get my gold Opal card. That, as you know, has been tested in the NCAT recently, or you may or may not know, and Transport for New South Wales got a bloody nose, at least at first instance. So what am I saying? When people deal with government, generally they're not dealing in a situation where they've got a real choice not to deal with government. So you shouldn't think that consent is a mechanism for individuals to make a decision about that dealing. And that's actually a good mindset to come from in thinking about privacy of the future, because if you don't think about consent, you can't play pass the parcel and pass the responsibility on to the consumer, the citizen. You have to take the responsibility yourself about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I think that's a really useful mindset. And have we been asleep at the wheel for the last few years? Well, maybe, maybe not. I think a lot of suppliers of products have actually been happily asleep at the wheel on the basis that they've outsourced the problem to consumers through consent. And you look at what Mark Zuckerberg had to say recently, you kind of get that sense. I don't think they were asleep at the wheel. I think they'd passed the parcel by consent, and when the federal government in the US said, no, you can't do that, suddenly, well, we take privacy seriously, we're terribly sorry.
Maybe it's taking advantage of others asleep at the wheel.
Yeah.
But, I'd like to just ask the last question of Sam, and it's just a bit of a wrap-up question on something that was touched on. We've mentioned the E word, but we have only once mentioned the G word, GDPR. I know it's not on the on our run sheet today, but I'm aware that the office has recently published in April some guidance for New South Wales agencies on GDPR. Would you like to just perhaps give us the key point from that? And you may also like to touch on the data breach notification guidelines for
Yes, thanks, Mel.
agencies.
And actually, with what Peter was saying about consent, I thought was interesting because the European Union General Data Protection Regulation comes in on the 25th of May, so very soon. It will have an impact right across the world. It's a significant change in privacy law in the EU, and it will impact all of us, including here in Australia, in one way or another. But the interesting thing is that I think the GDPR focuses even more on consent and making consent much more than just a tick and flick exercise, making sure that companies get genuine consent. So that's one point. But secondly, while it won't necessarily have a big impact on New South Wales agencies per se, we have produced a fact sheet because there is some impact on universities and tertiary sector agencies who may have students coming to study in Australia from the European Union. And so we have put that up on our website to give New South Wales agencies information about how the GDPR may affect them. Of course, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner has significant resources about the GDPR on its website because it will impact on businesses in Australia that do business in the EU or use data from EU citizens. So it is actually a legislation that has an extraterritorial reach. So there are implications for Australian businesses.